And our next speaker is Professor Maren Niehoff. Maren Niehoff is Max Cooper Chair of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University and member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Her research focuses on ancient Judaism, Greco-Roman culture, and early Christianity, and especially on their interactions. Among her numerous publications is Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual biography, Yale 2018, which has been translated into several languages. She is currently the head of the ERC project Romana, a Roman term among Jews, Greek pagans, and Christians. The title of her talk is Pillars of Caesarea Were Crying When Rabbi Abbahu Died, a Mediterranean city as a melting pot of cultures. Professor Niehoff, please.
It is a special privilege and pleasure to speak today at the symposium celebrating the work of Professor Benjamin Isaac, a world-renowned ancient historian and a personal role model. From my perspective, Ben is a paradigm of exhaustive research which takes into account every single and forgotten piece of evidence, ranging from literature in numerous languages to inscriptions and maps. His monograph, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, is typical of his approach, as it analyzes an often treated topic, namely ancient stereotypes, but transcends every scholar before him by collecting literally all the available information on the image of Greeks, Romans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Persians, Gauls, Germans, and finally also the Jews. Ben, however, is not only an energetic scholar with a sharp eye for details, but also envisions the larger picture. Under his pen, a new map of the Roman Empire has emerged with new borders and new internal strives. Not shy to challenge the scholarly consensus, Ben paves the very path he has unearthed, not 1 millimeter to the right and not 1 millimeter to the left. Moreover, as a humanist with a good sense of humor, Ben has always insisted on his Dutch roots, as if to remind us all not to be deluded by Zionist agendas of a melting pot that eliminates differences. Especially in the present time, this insistence on cultural hybridity is appreciated more than ever. I have chosen to speak today about Caesarea, a city which has occupied Ben for decades. In his research, based as usual on all the inscriptions and the available literature, he has emphasized Greek paideia as a common platform for all the different ethnic groups. In 220, we both attended a conference on Caesarea that took place at the Rothschild Foundation in the midst of the excavations. Ben excused himself for missing my lecture because he had to attend another meeting in Jerusalem. I didn't ask which meeting he would attend, but when later Nili Cohen, the head of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, called me up while we had dinner on the remains of Augustus's temple and announced to my utter surprise that I had been elected as a member of the Academy, I immediately understood which meeting Ben had attended. My paper today, Ben, is not the lecture you missed in Caesarea, but a new piece of research on one of the most iconic quotations from rabbinic literature, which demonstrates the Greek acculturation of the Jews of Caesarea, namely the phrase, when Rabbi Abbahu died, the pillars of Caesarea were crying. Text number 1 on your handout. Generations of scholars have taken this phrase as an indication of the profound Hellenization of one of the most prominent rabbis of the city, who lived in the 3rd century and exercised wide influence even beyond the land of Israel. Famous for insisting on Greek education for young girls and frequently using Greek expressions in his Bible exegesis, Rabbi Abbahu inscribed himself to such a degree in Greek culture that the pillars of the city cried on the occasion of his death. In other words, the representatives of Greek paideia treated Abbahu as one of theirs. Joseph Patrick, in his book, A Walk to Caesarea, consequently quotes that line about the Pillars of Caesarea next to another rabbinic phrase, according to which even the short prayer of the Shema was recited in Caesarea in Greek. Modern scholarship has thus far treated the image of the crying pillars in isolation, without the larger context, which is also on your handout. And attempted, since Emmanuel Yoel's passing remarks in 1880, to establish the relationship between the pillars crying on account of Rabbi Abbahu and those pillars crying on account of the Christian martyrs killed in Caesarea during the persecution under Diocletian in the early 3rd century. The latter are mentioned by Eusebius, the church historian and bishop of Caesarea, and this is text number 2 on your handout. Eusebius says, "After these things had continued for many days, namely the massacre of the Christians, a wonderful event occurred. The air was clear and bright, and the appearance of the sky most serene, when suddenly throughout the city from the pillars which supported the public porches, many drops fell like tears, and the marketplaces and the streets, though there was no mist in the air, were moistened with sprinkled water, whence I do not know. Then immediately it was reported everywhere that the earth, unable to endure the abominations of these things, had shed tears in a mysterious manner, and that as a rebuke to the relentless and unfeeling nature of man, namely the pagan emperors behind the persecution, stones and lifeless wood had wept for what had happened." And now Eusebius adds, "I know well that this account might perhaps appear idle and fabulous or mythos to those to whom after us, but not to those to whom the truth was confirmed at the time." Manuel Joel and follow him Shaul Lieberman took Eusebius' scientific formulations, and especially his emphasis that the story is no myth, as an indication that both this story and the rabbinic parallel refer to a historical event, namely a miraculous profusion of the Pillars of Caesarea during the persecution of the Christians. Each community interpreted the event with regard to its specific heroes. Surprisingly, Lieberman even deduces that Rabbi Abbahu, and I quote, died on a bright autumn day in 309. The fictitious dimension of the Christian story, however, is clear and emerges also from the different versions. The version on your handout is from the short recension, which is, according to many scholars, an abbreviation of the longer recension published by Eusebius immediately after the Edict of Tolerance in 911. That version, however, is largely lost, and none of the fragments testifies to our story. The Syrian translator subsequently transmits an even more dramatic version. He says, "Many of the columns of the porticos in the city emitted spots, as it were of blood, while the marketplaces and the streets became sprinkled and wet with water, although not a single drop had fallen from the heavens." In view of this clearly literary development, it is wise to follow Wilhelm Bacher, who interprets the rabbinic story as a poetic gesture to Rabbi Abbahu, which derived, in his words, from the love of his co-citizens. Today, I propose to elaborate this approach by offering a comprehensive literary analysis of the Talmudic passage in comparison to Genesis Rabbah. As we will see, the Midrash consists of two different layers, visible respectively in the manuscripts of Vatican and London. These two layers show the development of the Midrashic tradition and provide the hermeneutic key to the Talmudic passage and in its relation to Eusebius' story. So let's first read the complete Talmudic passage, number 1 on your handout. When Rabbi Abbahu died, the pillars of Caesarea were crying. The Samaritans said, "They only are making a joyful noise." The Jews told them, "Do outsiders know what sounds the insiders make?" When Rabbi Abbahu died, 13 rivers of balsam were flowing before him. He asked the people around him, "For whom are these?" They told him, "They are yours." And he said to them, "All of these are for Abbahu?" And I said, and now he's quoting a verse, and I said, "In vain I labored." The Holy One, blessed be He, shows to the just their rewards in this world. Their soul is satisfied and they go to sleep. This is analogous to a king who gave a dinner and pictured all kinds of dishes on a chart. When the guests entered, they saw it and were satisfied and went to sleep. Two features immediately stand out in this passage. There are two versions of the story of Rabbi Abbahu's death, and both start with identical introductions. Kadamach Rabbi Abbahu. The famous story is but one of the two versions, and it is characterized by open polemics against the Samaritans, who argue that the Pillars of Caesarea rejoiced rather than cried, as Rabbi Abbahu had caused the final break with the Samaritans. So in other words, the pillars were on the Samaritan side, and they were happy that they got rid of Rabbi Abbahu. It is furthermore remarkable that the second and less known version is the climax of a longer midrashic passage, which includes a dialogue between Rabbi Abbahu and his surroundings, as well as a general statement about God's treatment of the just, and finally, a parable illuminating God's approach. In this midrash, Rabbi Abbahu emerges as a righteous figure who is given preferred treatment by God. This distinction takes him by surprise, as he thought of himself as a person toiling in vain. Of the two versions of the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, only the second one is preserved in Genesis Rabbah, which, as I have shown elsewhere, oftentimes preserves the earlier rather than the later version of the tradition when there are parallels between the Midrash and the Jerusalem Talmud. In the present case, it is striking that the Midrash lacks the image of the pillars crying on account of Rabbi Abbahu, and instead features the story, and only the story, of the 13 rivers of Balsam at the end of a long sugya on Genesis 25, 7-8. Let's initially look at the manuscript London of the Midrash, which served the editors, Theodor and Albeck, as the base text of the critical edition, but has subsequently been identified by Michael Sokolov as a relatively late and unreliable text. While I do not have the time to read the whole passage, text number 3 on your handout, already a brief glimpse shows the hermeneutic flow of the sugya. And you will note that I use the term sugya very, very consciously. It starts with the death of Abraham, identified with the faultless person mentioned in Psalm, and then presents the interpretations of 3 Tannaitic teachers, which move from expiatory diseases to God's symposium for the righteous. Note that it is Rabbi Elazar who introduces the king parable. This is followed by the story of Rabbi Abbahu's death. The miraculous appearance of the 13 Balsam rivers indicates that he is a righteous next to Abraham, even though he himself is not aware of his extraordinary standing. And I highlighted in the text, I highlighted at the end in big letters the parallel story, the thing that the precise parallel that we have in Jerusalem Talmud. So I leave it for you to read that as we have just gone through it in the Jerusalem Talmud. As if this was not enough, Manuscript Vatican 30, the earliest and most reliable manuscript of the Midrash, again according to Michael Sokolov, is even more striking in its difference to the passage in the Jerusalem Talmud. To begin with, it is much shorter, and thus I can read it. It is the last passage on your handout. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life. The Lord knows the days of the faultless. Their legacy will last forever. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life. Abraham expired and died at a good old age, aged and content. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai said, the pious men of old would suffer from intestinal illness for 10 or 20 days, which teaches you that sickness cleanses. And Rabbi Yehuda said, anyone in whose regard expiring is stated died of intestinal illness. Rabbi Abbahu said, this is analogous to a feast that the king prepared. He invited the guests beforehand and showed the righteous in the hour of their death their future reward, and their souls are satisfied and they go to sleep. When Rabbi Abbahu died, 13 rivers were flowing before him. Manuscript Vatican 30, the earliest witness to the Midrashic tradition, features Rabbi Abbahu far more prominently as an interpreter of the verses from Genesis concerning Abraham. It is he, not Rabbi Elazar, who introduces the parable of the king and the symposium, and thus interprets the earlier Tannaitic traditions as an expression of expiratory suffering. The tradition of the 13 rivers flowing before Rabbi Abbahu is now added, obviously by a later exegete, as a kind of application of his exegesis to his own death. The tradition in MS Vatican is strikingly short and lacks the feature of Rabbi Abbahu's surprise and inquiry for whom the rivers are flowing. In this version, it rather seems that a student admiring Abbahu for his interpretation introduced the story as a self-evident expression of his greatness, comparing him implicitly to Abraham. To conclude, what has this archaeology of texts that we have conducted shown? If we read the text in their chronological order, namely from Vatican to London of Genesis Rabbah and then to the Jerusalem Talmud and Eusebius, we realize that the story about Rabbi Abbahu's death seems to have originated in the context of exegesis on Abraham's death. And initially it appears as a kind of an appendix to his own interpretation. At that earliest level, his towering statue was self-evident, probably reflecting the esteem of his most immediate environment in Caesarea. At a secondary level, namely in manuscript London, Rabbi Abbahu's part in the interpretation of Genesis is already reduced, and the element of his surprise at the extraordinary honors befalling him is introduced. This version seems to reflect a more distant perspective, perhaps possibly that of Tiberias, the rival center of rabbinic scholarship, where both the Midrash and the Talmud were redacted in their final layers. The Jerusalem Talmud preserves a version of the story close to manuscript London and adds the image of the crying pillars in a polemic against the Samaritans. It is not only the latest layer of the tradition, but also the one most removed from Abbahu's exegetical activity. It presents him from a distance, using a motif that seems to have become famous in connection with the Christian martyrs. His opposition to the Samaritans is embraced by the redactors of the Jerusalem Talmud and enriched by a domesticated Christian motif. So this archaeology of text, in fact, also entails a morale, which I'm sure Ben shares. It is particularly relevant to academics. When the pillars bow down and cry out in flattery, better check whether they are preparing to do away with your work and your wisdom in favor of their own agendas. I want to conclude with some personal wishes to you, Ben, in your mother tongue. And this was the most difficult part of the lecture to prepare. Nog vele jaren van onderzoek, creativiteit en gezinsleven.